Beyond Science, Conversations with Arthur M. Young. Interviewer Charles Fauvre discusses issues of science and consciousness with Arthur Young, honored inventor of the Bell helicopter, philosopher, and author of The Reflexive Universe. Today, reading the message of science, a look at the need to interpret the findings of modern science.
Hello, Arthur. In your writings, you've stated that your role is to read the message for which science has set the type. Could you help me to understand that?
Well, science has to follow its own ritual, its own regimen of putting things in the right place. And it never gets a chance to stand back and look at what it's done. As Bacon said, you have to get out of the plane of the level of one science to comprehend the significance of that science. But also the age we're living in, as distinct from, say, previous ages like when Buddhism was the dominating thesis or Egypt and so on. This is an age of objectification. Everything gets turned outward. The alchemists were the first manifestation of this, in that they talked about this process of putting things in this vessel and subjecting it to fire and sublimation and this and that. They never said what the vessel was. The vessel was the self. But such was their approach that they objectified the whole process as though it was something out there. Mm-hmm. And this is sort of the message of the present time, that everything is supposed to be out there, but it's really an alchemical operation where you're transforming the self through this process. So again, we come to the type, which is out there, but the meaning in here, but they're interrelated.
So we have a great opportunity in this technical age to balance our internal work with an external context.
Well, we get lost in the process now.
Science itself gets lost in the process, you're saying.
Well, we get lost because we're hypnotized by or fascinated by science. I have these antique cars, and you're always taking them apart. All the screws and the bolts and the gears are all over the place. Mm-hmm. And then well, what's the use of a car? It's all over the place, but you're fascinated with this process. You can take it apart. Mm-hmm. But the thing is to get it back together. Mm-hmm. I want to address that problem, and that's what I mean by reading the message. We've taken it all apart. Now we know less than ever. We know a lot about details, but it doesn't work.
We're at the point of supreme reduction here.
And we have to get to the point where we can put it together and see how it really works. One of the things that is to translate science, the language of science, back into English. Mm-hmm. And I was very much impressed with Max Jammer. He's a very important scientist who's made a very careful analysis of the history of science. One of his books is called The Concept of Mass. And he goes back through Einstein, through Newton, tracing the concept of mass back mm-hmm. to its first origins. Mm-hmm. And what would you think he traced it to?
Couldn't guess.
The Holy Communion.
Oh.
The Greek Mass. Mm-hmm. He distinguished himself. He doesn't mean Mass itself, but the concept of Mass. And the important thing about the concept of the Mass is the communion. The this is my body, this is my blood, when you take the communion, you're incorporating the body of Christ. Now, the body of Christ is a spiritual body. Now, that's a contradiction in terms, in a sense. But it has meaning in that something is transmitted. I'm talking about the concept of Mass. Something is incorporated that you didn't have before. And to say that that is the basis for the concept of Mass in science is awfully far out, especially coming from a scientist.
Yes.
But if you think about it, what are you incorporating every day?
Incorporating Mass.
Yeah, what Mass are you incorporating?
Food.
Right,
Indeed.
but in a spiritual way.
In a spiritual way. I suppose my experience.
Right. Your experience creates a body of memory, and this is cumulative. It develops and develops. And that is, I think, the sense that Max Jammer means, because at any rate, I like to apply that and say that the generation of Mass, translated into English, is memory of experience.
So this mass of experience becomes my memory bank.
Right.
In essence.
And it's, in a sense, what you're here for, is to get some experience, some memory, some Mass. This is spiritual investment in matter.
The basic stuff
achieves Mass.
Stuff of learning.
Right.
By equating Mass with memory, aren't you succumbing to anthropomorphism? That is, equating scientific and human qualities?
I know I've been spanked for that many, many times, but I finally waked up and realized that why not? The condemnation of anthropomorphism is that it's not scientific, but presumably scientific uses the simplest kind of thing, binary. A is either A or not A, like a computer. But that's only a subset of total thinking, that binary thinking. And if you're going to get any really interesting ideas, you have to get beyond binary. And thinking has a wide spectrum. Let's use it. Especially, I'm not in the laboratory now. I'm reading the type. I'm wanting to know the meaning of this message. If you're going to insist that it must be only comprehensible to a computer, well, then you're not reading the message. You're just staying at that level.
So we get into the situation again where the words, if we get lost in them, the plate runs away with the spoon.
Right. In any case, play along with it. Let's see what happens. And I've found it's not only that memory has an equivalence to mass, but connected to is that force is attraction. Okay, now suppose you say, well, don't be anthropomorphic. Explain what force is without referring to attraction, because attraction is something that people understand.
Yes.
Well, then you get into these ridiculous things like saying force is a bunch of particles flying back and forth.
Right.
And I think that's so absurd I don't even want to talk about it.
It's taking the life out of it.
Well, first place, it's not scientifically correct. The photons, which are said to be carriers of force, are not carriers of force. They're carriers of action. And action is quite a different thing.
Yes.
It's only, and well, the more and more objections there, but I better get back on my track, which is that if we carry the notion of anthropomorphic thinking, we can get more out of things.
Like, for example, you equated purpose with light as well. Can you show us how that you get more out of things by doing that?
Right. Well, I wanted to carry, I've done that. I want to carry it further now.
Okay.
And this is what I've only done just recently,
Yes.
which is to recognize what was happening in the atom. And I was almost forced to it, because the next stage after the creation of particles, which is the creation of mass and the creation of attraction, is the creation of atoms. And atoms have this new feature that nothing had before, the identity, ego-ness. Now that's already anthropomorphic, but you don't have to say that the atoms are egos. So you can save it for human, and then it's all right. But there is this fact that the atoms use up more of the uncertainty that was potential at the beginning. You remember we started with total uncertainty?
Yes, indeed.
And then I didn't say it in these talks, but when you get the first investment in particles, you lose more than 99% of that uncertainty in order to establish the mass, to get some fixed energy. You turn the free energy into fixed
You
energy.
pay a heavy price for that. Pardon the pun.
Now that when you get the atoms, you get a further reduction of somewhat the same order, but it does not create mass. So the question was, I had to ask myself, what does it create? And I had to recognize that it creates discrimination. And that's anthropomorphic. But I don't know what else to call it. The atom has a discrimination which is absolutely extraordinary. You know, it picks up light coming, say, from the sun of the right frequency. Well, you pick up things of the right frequency with a radio.
Right.
But the amount of discrimination is of the order of 1%. In other words, if the dial isn't just on, you're still getting that radio signal. But with light, the order of error is of the order of 1 in 4 billion.
Wow.
Accuracy is so remarkable. And it's one of the major problems of science, how this works. Because the light that the atom has picked up is a wavelength about 5,000 times as big as the atom. Normally, a radio, you have an antenna that's approximately the size of the wavelength that you're picking up. Those a TV antenna on the roof, that's about the same size as the wave you're picking up. But here we're picking up, with the atom, 1/5,000th of that. In other words, something like 1/100th of an inch is your antenna. To compare it with life, I would have to go to organ transplants. You know how difficult it is to make an organ transplant because the organism rejects anything that's not its own.
Yes.
I think once in a while you can get an identical twin and make an organ transplant. But not everyone has an identical twin, so it's very difficult. In fact, the organism can distinguish an organ from any one of, say, 4 billion people on the surface of the planet. So it's the same order of magnitude as the discrimination of the atom. Now, I get a lot of mileage out of that because this is also an abstract principle, and we've gotten to a recognition of it by going ahead and being anthropomorphic. How else could you describe discrimination in an atom except by using the word anthropomorphic?
I think that's very well taken. And
Well, I carried it a little further with molecules. Now, in atoms, this discrimination is solely self-oriented. That's me and that's not me. It's purely selfish. But with the molecule, it's what's good for the combination. And in human terms, it's learning, well, what's good for the children. Or, I mean, it's not ego-oriented. It reaches out and takes in a wider group. Eventually, it can be what's good for the whole entire organism, as in a plant or as in a company. You think, or what's good for the country. I'll do what's good for the nation, what's good for the best interest of the people.
I see.
This would be the ideal leader, would act in the best interests of the people. This requires discrimination, but in its application to a larger context, it has to be learned at first on the ego level, and then it can be understood on the greater scale.
All right. Well, at what stage does consciousness enter the physical picture?
This is consciousness. You see, we're showing how consciousness develops. Remember, right at the beginning, with the the infant or the particle, it's this feeling of attraction, feeling of longing, wanting something. It's an awareness of otherness. That's the beginning of the development of the consciousness. And then the awareness of me and what's good for me, and comparing things. Why do you compare them? Because you want to know what you like best. I mean, first you fall in love with one girl, and then you fall in love with the next girl, and you might go on until you start comparing them and say, well, let's see now, what do I really want? Then you begin to be ego. But that's a step in this development of consciousness, and it carries on through all the other stages. But you see, what I'm doing now is drawing on the findings of science, reading the type in human terms.
Yes.
Helping to understand where we are in this vast thing and get ourselves back together. I mean, eventually, if we could just go back and be Shakespeare's, we wouldn't need all this science. But we're like bugs crawling across a Shakespeare manuscript. First we just see ink, and then we see maybe there's such thing as words and so on. We begin to put this gradually together, sentences, and then we realize it's marvelous poetry, and this is an opus of great beauty.
That's
that
wonderful.
We're crawling
and
across.
that's what you're doing in reading.
Trying to do.
Yes. I think you're doing a great job of it. I guess another thing I'd like to know about is comments I've heard about your work constituting a new paradigm in science and in human understanding. Would you care to comment on that at all? What that means
I've been
to you?
going all out for this new paradigm ever since I read Kuhn, and people started talking about paradigms.
Kuhn was someone who began to talk about paradigms.
Right, he was the first one. He talked about the revolution in science based on paradigms. If you go on the assumption that the universe is made out of particles and that everything is particles combining, shall we say, that's a paradigm. Now you can say, well, no, it isn't particles, it's consciousness. That could be a paradigm. I don't say it is, but because the consciousness people haven't come up with any definite schedule. You see, it's just a vague term.
It is, you vaguely used, yes.
And the point about science, I mean, the whole point, I could say, is that it was an opportunity to be more complete and more precise. What's the use of taking a car apart unless you're going to fix it and know how it works? I mean, that's what that was my analogy, that today we've taken everything apart. But the benefit from that is when we do get it back together, we'll understand how it works and be able to use that knowledge in new applications.
When you mention that in the newer consciousness concepts, the reference to new paradigms is not tightly defined. It seems to me that part of the paradigm itself in newer levels of consciousness is that tight definition is not only impossible but unnecessary.
I see. Well, we were going to bring in the notion of infinity.
All right.
Now, infinity, there's something wonderful about infinity. I mean, you're drawn to it.
Indeed.
So it's very intriguing. But the Greeks had a different view. They said that the universe was founded or based on four toads. Rested on four toads.
Uh-huh.
And one was nothing, and one was invisibility, and one was infinity. I've forgotten what the fourth one was.
All right.
But notice that at least the first two are negative. Nothing and invisibility. Nothing is visible, nothing exists, and no definition is what infinity is. It's a negative term. Infinite, without boundary.
Without, well, isn't that also positive? In that it's totally
Well, I'm
expanded?
pointing out that it's also negative. I
All
started.
right. It's also negative.
Right, but
right.
look, you can see it as a negative. It has no definition. You can't pick it up. You can't deal with it. There's no way to treat it.
Yes.
Now, the purpose of the ordinary universe is to get things that you can handle. The infinite lies beyond. You could say that the finite comes out of the infinite. In fact, you more or less have to. You have to have the infinite before you have the finite.
Right.
And that's what the Greeks meant.
Right. And then, of course, we go back
Then you
from
go back to the infinite,
right.
but then you
Yes.
have what you needed to use. You can create these infinite
Yes.
opportunities and so forth.
So it seems that what we're recognizing is that some of the newer paradigms, which are moving back toward the infinite and are expansionistic rather than reductionistic, are following the same process that we've discussed here.
Well, if they're going back to infinity, they're not going forward to infinity, is what I would say. And the way ahead goes through the finite.
I think how they would feel about that is that indeed they have gone through the finite, recognizing that we don't need to be seduced by a search for the finite anymore, or attached to its definition. That we have learned that it
Well,
has
let's say we want, all right, this is a
Okay.
very critical issue, and I would like to subscribe to what you said, but I feel that we haven't quite got there yet.
we're not quite ready yet.
It needs to have this grounding in science before it can talk in these highfalutin.
Oh, I entirely agree with you. I'm not trying to say that the grounding in science wasn't needed. If we're looking at some of the newer paradigms, they are starting back up the side of the arc, as I see it.
Right. Well, I would like to find these newer paradigms that actually do that.
And very, very often, in their seduction toward expansion, they reject the values of science, hard science, that have served them so well. This is typical of, I think, of any process whereby kids grow up and reject their parents, and the pendulum has to swing to the point of rebellion.
Yes.
So indeed that is incomplete, if that's what you're saying. And as long as, and eventually the recognition of the value of combination, which I think is what you so well portray.
Synthesis.
The synthesis of the
Right.
two must be carried on in order to keep it grounded, keep it focused, and chart a true course.
Well, give it what it needs to succeed. That's what I've learned from trying to make a helicopter. My first effort was to make a machine to go to Mars. And that, I fortunately only spent a year on that before I realized that I was unsound in my principles. But finding what was sound and what was not sound was part of the path. It doesn't mean that it's limiting. It means that your efforts become successful. It's the difference between jumping out the window with the desire to fly and falling on your face and providing the necessary wherewithal to do so.
Yeah.
You need science to transcend science, or you need science to erase the current science. Whatever it is, it has to go back together the way it came apart. And I think science only deals with the things you can manipulate. We have to get on with it to the things beyond ourselves.
And is there some urgency to doing that in your view?
Well, obviously we're going to blow ourselves up or pollute the planet. There are all these commands coming that we've got to straighten out and fly right.
So reading the type
Reading the type. Yeah.
is important. It's a little speed reading is required here.
Right.
Well, Arthur, I think our half an hour is just about up, and it certainly has flown by for me. I've enjoyed it very much again.
Thank you.